The Rambam opens up Hilchos Talmud Torah by telling us that Ktanim Pturim miTalmud Torah. Now, there is another uh, text of the Rambam based on manuscripts, which is brought down in the Frankel edition of the Rambam, that leaves out the word Ktanim. But most of the commentaries, like our printed Rambams, have the word Ktanim. And it would seem that the Rambam felt compelled to tell us that a katan is potter from the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And one would wonder why. After all, does the Rambam have to tell me about tzitzis and tefillin and every other mitzvah in the Torah that a katan is potter? We know that a katan is a lav bar chiyuv. He's not obligated to any mitzvahs. And the Rambam doesn't waste any words. Now, the second question, which I think would answer the first question as well, is then the Rambam goes on to say, Avol Katan, Aviv Chayev L'Lamdo Torah, which is a very unusual structure in the language of the Rambam, Avol. He very rarely uses the word Avol. When he does, he means that despite the fact that you would have drawn a certain conclusion, Avol, but that's not true. And what the Rambam is trying to convey, perhaps, is that he's limiting his original statement. He's saying that although a katan is not obligated to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, nevertheless, the avol is sort of like, that's dafka the katan, but the father has to teach him Torah. And apparently one could have drawn the conclusion, based on the Gemara in Kiddushin, that if the recipient of Torah is exempt from Talmud Torah, then there's no mitzvah to teach him Torah. Right? We have the Nosein HaTorah and the Makabel HaTorah. If the Makabel HaTorah is included in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, then and only then, we could argue, it makes sense to impose an obligation of Nesinas HaTorah such that the Makabel will receive his Torah. But if the Makabel himself, in this case the Katan, has no mitzvah to receive the Torah, then we would have thought that there's no mitzvah to transmit the Torah to him. Limsar lo, or laseis lo es HaTorah. So the Rambam opens up Hilchos Talmud Torah by telling me two things. One is that a katan is potter from Talmud Torah, and number two, that the father has to teach him Torah. And therefore we see a split between one who is exempt from Torah and another who's obligated to teach that person who's exempt from Torah. And this stands in contrast to the Isha, because in the case of the Isha, the Rambam says, she likewise is potter from Talmud Torah, but yet the Rambam says that even though she's potter from Talmud Torah, you would still entertain the possibility that maybe she would have to teach Torah. And that's what the Rambam is going to address at the end of this halacha. But at the beginning of this halacha, he establishes that we don't have to teach neither a woman Torah nor a katan Torah. But in the case of a katan, the father is obligated to teach the katan Torah. And that's is a kind of a break, a kind of a split, because if the katan doesn't have the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, why would we impose a chiyuv on anyone to teach him Torah? And perhaps that's why the Rambam feels compelled at this point to quote a pasuk. Shenemar v'limanitem osam es b'nechem ledaber bom. We're familiar with this pasuk from Kriyat Shema. And the Torah is talking about someone who has to teach Torah libnechem, to his son. Now, who is his son? Is he a katan? Is he a gadol? Well, the Rambam assumes he's a katan. And at this point, we have a fundamental controversy as to what the Rambam has in mind. Now, let me take a little bit of a census here. We'll try to come up with what we think the Rambam has in mind. And I'm going to offer you two possibilities. And keep in mind the word shenemar. Does the Rambam hold that the father's obligation to teach Torah to his son, who's a katan, is DeOraisa, or is it Rabbanan? So just by a show of hands, for those who have their camera on, tell me if you think it's DeOraisa. Anyone? Okay, we have one hand up, two hands up. All right, two people think it's DeOraisa. Who thinks it's the Rabbanan? One second. David, are you, well, it depends which David, but David Spiegel, are you saying it's the Rabbanan?
I think so. I'm not sure.
But if it says Shenemar, I mean, again, if I show you 50 Ramams all over the show, and the Rambam constantly tells you Shenemar and he quotes a pasuk in Chumash, I'm not talking about, quoting a pasuk somewhere in, in Divrei Hayomim, but I'm talking about a pasuk in Chumash.
Uh,
Wouldn't you say that certainly it's DeOraisa?
yeah, sorry.
That's what I would have said. Anyway, now one of the super commentaries on the Rambam, he's called Rabbi Elazar Okeach, and he wrote a work that's called Arba Ture Even on the Rambam, and he claims that the Rambam holds that the father's obligation to teach his son Torah is DeOraisa. And that's why the Rambam says Shenemar, to quote a pasuk to prove that the Torah obligates the father to teach his son. And when I saw this inside, which I got to through the Frankel Rambam, if you're familiar with that edition of the Rambam, I said to myself, Pshita Michael Mashmalon. Why do I need one of the greats from centuries ago to tell me that the Rambam has a mind of mitzvah d'oraisa? I mean, it's poshut, it's straightforward. But then I began to think that maybe it's not so simple. And I had a number of questions on the Arba Tur Evan's interpretation and his assumption. My first question is that we have a principle that there's no obligation to teach Torah to someone who he himself is not obligated. And that we saw last time we met in the Gemara in Kiddushin Chav Tes. And the Gemara says, Kol shemitzuvel lelamed es atzmo, anyone who's obligated to teach himself, meaning to learn Torah, acherim chayovim lelamdo. So, for example, in the case of an Isha, she's not obligated to teach herself or to study Torah, if you want to call it that way, and therefore the father doesn't have to teach her Torah. And if we apply that principle to the Katan, then the father should not have to teach his son Torah. But maybe the Rabbanan made a certain takana. We'll have to see why, but that the father does have to teach Torah, but it's only rabbinic. Then add another question. If the chiyuv to teach your son Torah, and he's a katan, is DeOraisa, then shouldn't it be counted in the Sefer Mitzvos as one of the Taryag mitzvahs? And yet the Rambam doesn't have the mitzvah of a father to teach his son Torah. Very strange. Why did the Rambam omit it? The third question that bothered me a little bit, not so much, but why does the Rambam quote the pasuk Lidaber Bam? He could have stopped short. Every word in the Rambam has to be accounted for. Well, why did he need to tell me Lidaber Bam? So let's just review our three questions. Question number one, if Indeed, the father's obligation to teach his son Torah when he's a katan is DeOraisa, then how is the case of a katan different from the case of an isha? Because we said in the case of an isha, since she doesn't have the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, we don't have to teach her. Applying that same klal, that same rule, to the case of a katan, since the katan doesn't have to study Torah, as the Ram opens up and he says, katan patur min Talmud Torah, then we shouldn't have to teach him Torah. Second question that we asked is, if the Rambam holds that teaching Torah is an obligation incumbent on the father on a DeOraisa level, he should have counted that as a mitzvah in Taryag. And the third question was more of a technical question. Why does he add the words ledaber bam? So at this point, we want to introduce to the stage one of the great Sephardic rabbis from Saloniki. You heard of Saloniki in Greece? There used to be a gigantic Jewish center of learning in Saloniki. And there was a Rav by the name of Rav Shrero who lived in the early 1700s. And he says that the Rambam means that the father's obligation to teach his son Torah is only derabanan. It's only rabbinic. And he asks the question, well, where in the constellation of the Darabanans do we find such a mitzvah of Talmud Torah? And his answer is, take a look at a brisa in Masechtas Sukkah on Daf Mem Beis. And the brisa there is the most fundamental source for the mitzvah of chinuch. Now, chinuch, keep in mind, is a takanas chachamim, a rabbinic obligation to teach a child those mitzvos, which ultimately, when he becomes bar mitzvah, he'll be obligated in. And the brisa goes through a whole list. And the brisa wants to tell us that Rabbanon instituted an obligation of chinuch, but only if the child reaches what's called higia lechinuch. And the brisa continues and says that higia lechinuch is relative to the mitzvah itself. Every mitzvah has a different time period, which is called higia lechinuch. So, for example, in the case of tzitzis, the brisa establishes that if the katan is yodel lehisatev, which, by the way, even to this day, I'm not sure how to do that, but there are a couple of different ways, then you are obligated to teach him tzitzis. If he is able to guard his tefillin properly, which means, he knows how to keep his body clean when he wears tefillin, then the father buys him a pair of tefillin. That's the mitzvah of chinuch for tefillin. Then the brisa says, if the child is able to do nanuim on a lulav, then there's a mitzvah of chinuch on the lulav. By the way, nanuim, we call it shake your lulav. I don't know if you ever saw that video. Shake your lulav. Yeah, but it's very complicated. I once tried to go through the Siman and Shulchan Aruch about nanuim, and I calculated about 18 different opinions about how to do nanuim. And probably you'll see all 18 of them if there's more than 18 people in the shul, So nobody knows how to do nanuim. But let's say you have a very precocious child and he knows how to do nanuim, then he's obligated in chinuch. Then the brisa says, "V'katan hayodel lidaber." I'll emphasize that word again, lidaber. Aviv malamdo Torah. The father teaches him Torah. And the brisa goes on to say, teach him Torah tziva lanu Moshe Marosha Kilas Yaakov, and go ahead and teach him the first pasuk in Kriyat Shema, Shema Yisrael. These are the obligations of the father with regard to Torah once his son reaches the age of Yodea Lidaber. Comes along the Mishnah Kesef, again from 1750 or earlier, And he says, hey, why is the father's obligation to teach his son Torah listed in the Brisa in Sukkah and Beis amongst the obligations of chinuch? This is a mitzvah DeOraisa. It says, it's like a fish out of water. It doesn't belong there. And according to the Mishnah Kesef, this led the Rambam to the conclusion that the obligation of a father to teach his son Torah is only rabbinic. It's only D'Rabbanan. It's a takonis chachamim for chinuch. And therefore, the Mishnah Kesef claims that on a DeOraisa level, the father doesn't have to teach his son Torah because the son himself is exempt from the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, like he's exempt from all mitzvahs. And there's only an obligation to teach someone Torah if that someone has a mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Since the katan does not have a mitzvah of Talmud Torah, therefore there's no mitzvah to teach the katan. Now, if that be the case, then why does the Rambam say that the father has to teach his son Torah? Says the Mishnah Kesef, that's on a D'Rabbanan level, mishum chinuch. And the father is responsible for the chinuch of his child. And the Rambam adds two words over here, lidaber bam. Why does the Rambam add those two words, lidaber bam? He wants to tell you that the mitzvah of chinuch, which was established by the Rabbanon, emerges when the child fits the description of lidaber bam, meaning he's yodea lidaber. And the addition of those two words is meant by the Rambam as an allusion to that brisa in Sukkah, which has an entire list of mitzvos of chinuch, all of which are d'Rabbanan. And in the case of Talmud Torah, the mitzvah of chinuch for the child begins once the child knows how to speak. So the shenemar here in the Rambam, according to the Mishnah Kesef, is not the same identical shenemar in all of the Rambam. It's a different type of shenemar. It's what you call an asmachta. You know, very often I don't have to tell you that when the Rabbanim make an institution, they try to hang their hat on a peg, you know, and find some sort of an allusion in a pasuk in Tanakh. So they wanted to impose a chiv on the father to teach his son Torah from the point of Yodea L'daber, when the child knows how to speak, probably 2 or 3 years old. Which reminds me to tell you, don't get nervous if a child develops speech later on. I find that the child who develops speech later on are the most verbal people in the world. You know, you can have an Albert Einstein, but, you know, he didn't start speaking till the age of 5. You know what I'm saying? But we get very nervous about that. And we pay a lot of money to go to different, you know, psychologists and see why the child is not speaking. But in any event, usually a child will start speaking somewhere between 1.5, 2, and 3 years old. And the Rambam wants to find an allusion in a pasuk, meaning a remez or an asmachta, to the fact that the Rabbanan would impose a chiv on the father to teach his son Torah when the son is very, very young. He's only reached the level of Yodea L'daber, the low, like the first level of intelligence. And at that point, we quote the pasuk of "V'lemadatem osam esbnechem l'daber bam" as an asmachta. But what's the real pshat in that pasuk? According to the Mishnah Kesef, the real pshat in that pasuk is b'nechem hagedolim, meaning the obligation of the father on a DeOraisa level to teach his son Torah is only when the son passes bar mitzvah, because at that point the son becomes obligated in Talmud Torah, and now we could say that kol shemitzuve l'lamed es atzmo acherim mitzuvim l'lamdo. As we said at the outset, the rule of thumb based on the Gemara in Kiddushin is that if X, Mr. X we'll call him, he has an obligation to study Torah, then we can impose upon Mr. Y an obligation to teach him Torah. So at what point does the katan, we'll call him Mr. X, have the obligation to learn Torah? When he becomes bar mitzvah. At that point, Mr. Y, who in this case is his father, has to teach him Torah. So on a DeOraisa level, the limanatim osam esbnechem really emerges only after the child is a gadol. But on a D'Rabbanan level, which we call the mitzvah of chinuch, as soon as the child is Yodea L'daber, which is a very young age, the father is obligated to teach him Torah. And if we go back to the first opinion in the Rambam, which I quoted the name of Rabbi Lozer Okeach, the Baal Arba Turei Even, and asked the question, so why did the Brisa in Sukkah, on this whole enumerated list of the mitzvah of chinuch, why didn't it include the father's obligation to teach the son Torah when he's Yodea L'daber? Doesn't that prove that it's chinuch? Doesn't that prove that the entire obligation incumbent on the father is only d'Rabbanan because the takon of chinuch? But it comes out that according to the Arba Turei Even, we really have to, in a sense, divide up the list in the Brisa and Sukkah that we refer to into two categories. If we're talking about lulav, tzitzis, tefillin, that's all a mitzvah of chinuch imposed on the father, and it's all d'Rabbanan. But when we get to the katan and Yodea L'daber, that's not a chiyuv chinuch, that's a chiyuv DeOraisa. Now, you might ask the following question. We started with an intuitive, how should we say, knee-jerk response that the Rambam certainly holds that the chiyuv on the father to teach his son a katan is DeOraisa, but yet now we turn the tables around. Because now we have so many proofs that seem to indicate that the Rambam is talking about a chiyuv d'Rabbanan mishum chinuch, that we wonder, why wouldn't the Arba Turei Even accept the pshat of the Mishnah Kesef that in that brisa in Sukkah we're talking about the mitzvah of chinuch? And I think the answer to this question lies inherent in a precise definition of chinuch. What do I mean? The Arba Turei Even could not possibly accept that a katan Yodea L'daber is to be classified as a Giya L'chinuch and teach him Torah in order to prepare him because he's a Giya L'chinuch. No, that can't be. We've got to split the brisa in half and take out this part of the brisa. It's not chinuch. Why not? What bothered the Arba Turei Even to such an extent that he's going to reinterpret this brisa? He's not going to accept the simple, straightforward understanding that the father's obligation to teach his son Torah when he's Yodea L'daber is chinuch. No, it's not chinuch. It's DeOraisa. Why? Well, why not call it chinuch? I mean, is Talmud Torah worse than any other mitzvah that gets chinuch? Should a father not be preparing his son for the great mitzvah Talmud Torah that he'll be obligated in when he becomes bar mitzvah? I mean, if the father is obligated to prepare his son for tzitzis and tefillin and lulav, etc., he certainly should be preparing his son for the mitzvah Talmud Torah, no? Imagine if the Rabbanan did not obligate the father, so all of a sudden the child gets bar mitzvah, he doesn't know an aleph from a beis, he's never seen a chumash or a blat gemara, he's totally lost. If the father never taught him how to take a lulav, then he's totally lost. If the father didn't take him to buy tefillin for him, he's totally lost. You got to prepare the child. You can't expect that on his bar mitzvah day, all of a sudden, abracadabra, he knows how to perform all these mitzvahs. Get him into the habit. Do you know what I mean by the habit? In Hebrew, it's called hergel. Lahargiloto. You've got to train him. Imagine if a person is going to play a great basketball game against one of the great teams, and he's never practiced basketball. A man is going to entertain a whole audience in piano playing, and he never took a lesson in piano. I mean, you got to prepare. But here I think one good question deserves another. When we go through the brisa carefully in Sukkah Daf Mem Beis, the subject of which is chinuch, we're stuck with the following question. And that's why I say this question hopefully will answer the first question. But what is my question? At what age can a child put on tzitzis physically, or put on tefillin, or shekalula? Probably at the age of 3, 4, 5, whatever it is. But thus stating it in the Brisa. The Brisa doesn't say that. The Brisa says that it's not enough that he picks up the lulav. He's not Higil Lechinuch. He's Higil Lechinuch when he gets to the mature level that he can do Nanuim. He's Higil Lechinuch not when he can put on tefillin, but when he knows how to be shomer tefillin. He's not obligated in chinuch, in tzitzis, until he's misatev b'tzitzis. What is the underlying definition of Higil Lechinuch? Higil Lechinuch will change relative to each mitzvah. And in each mitzvah, we're going to have to establish Higil Lechinuch. But what standard will we require for Higil Lechinuch? Is it the lowest standard or the highest standard? Is it the basic Kiyum HaMitzvah or is it the Shleimus HaMitzvah? In my sefer, which is called Hagigei Oz, which I hope, gentlemen, you'll get to read and study, I'll be very happy if that happens. So I point out that in the mitzvah of Kiddush, the Shleimus HaMitzvah is Yayin. You might be able to be Yotze without Yayin. The Magen Avraham says you can be Yotze with Tefillah without Yayin, but that's not the Shleimus HaMitzvah. Every mitzvah has different gradations, different levels, until you reach the top, and that's called the Shleimus HaMitzvah, the perfect way of doing the mitzvah. In the case of Lulav, the perfection of the mitzvah of Lulav, even though again, Mida'ag Bei Nafik Bei, but the real perfection, the Shleimus, is Nanuim. In the case of Tefillin, okay, you can put on the Tefillin, but you might mess up over here. You're not on the highest level. You're not ready for the mitzvah of Shmiras HaTefillin. And in the case of Tzitzis, the highest level of putting on Tzitzis is Hisatev Batzitzis. So now, the Arba Turi Evan is asking the following question. At what point does a child become Higil Lechinuch with regard to Talmud Torah? Well, the lowest level of Talmud Torah might be Odel Ledaber. You don't teach him like a tuki, how do you say, a parrot, a parakeet, to say Shema Yisrael or to say Torah Tziva Lona Moshe, whatever it is. But that's not the real Kiyum HaMitzvah. The real Kiyum HaMitzvah is not when he's 2 or 3 years old, but when he's at least, 6, 7, 8, I don't know what age it is, that he begins to understand the Torah. You can teach him psukim, you can teach him whatever, and he understands. So although there's something called Kriya Psukim, but that's not Havana B'Psukim. Do you follow, Rabbi, say the difference between the two? If I had a whiteboard, that's what I would write on the whiteboard here. I would write that there's Kriya B'Psukei Torah, and then there's Havana B'Psukei Torah. This 2-year-old boy, or let's say he's 3 years old, he's Yodel Ledaber, he has reached the level of Kriyas HaPsukim. He has the power of speech, he can read the Psukim. But he is very far from reaching the level of the Shleimus HaMitzvah, which is Havanas HaPsukim. He really is not capable of understanding. Now, in general, we find a difference in halacha between Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. In Torah Shebechsav, you read the Torah, you get some brownie points for that. There's a Kiyum HaMitzvah, or shall we say a Mixas Kiyum HaMitzvah, a partial Kiyum HaMitzvah. But in Torah Shebal Peh, if you just read the words of a Mishnah or a Talmud, and you don't understand what you're reading, it's worthless. There's no such thing as Kriya b'Torah Shebal Peh. Torah Shebal Peh is all about Havana, about understanding. So obviously the shleimus, the perfection of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, is not just Torah Shebechsav, reading it like a tuki, but rather to achieve Torah Shebal Peh and understand the Torah. Havanas HaTorah. So the Torah Yeven now gets into a bind, because if the mitzvah of chinuch and the definition of higil chinuch for a child is Yodel L'Kaimis HaMitzvah V'Shleimus, then why does Yodel L'Daber appear on the list for the chinuch of Talmud Torah? And the Arba Turi Even, I think, was so bothered by this, he only had one possible answer, that the mitzvah of teaching your son Torah is DeOraisa. It's not a rabbinic institution of chinuch. Now, you could say that according to the Arba Turi Even, in addition to teaching the Torah to the child, which the Torah says, add to that a mitzvah d'rabbanan of chinuch. You pile it up one on top of the other. And then I'm going to ask you, why nafkamina? Why would the Rabbanan add a level of chinuch when the father is obligated midoraisa? Joe?
Just want to clarify. So you're saying the Turi Even saying this because the Rambam doesn't say a specific time that the child is able to understand it.
Right.
That's why you're saying this.
The Rambam identifies the time for the chiyuv of the father as Yodel Ledaber, following in
but not Yodel to understand.
Right. So the Rambam would say that a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old who can speak, you already have as a father an obligation to teach him Torah. And the Turi Even says that can't be chinuch, because chinuch requires that you fulfill the mitzvah of shleimus, which will require havanas haTorah. And if the child is only Yodel Ledaber and clearly doesn't understand the Torah, then he's not Higil L'chinuch. So this could not possibly be a candidate for Chinuch D'Rabbanan. It could only be a mitzvah Chiv DeOraisa under V'Limadet Mosam Espenechem. But then again, the Arba Turi Even has to now deal with the fact that the Rambam doesn't count the obligation of the father as a mitzvah d'oraisa. But before we get to that, let's just think, why is there an additional obligation of chinuch? Why did the Rabbanan have to add another layer on top of the cake if the father's obligation is d'oraisa? So I'm just looking at the pages that David was kind enough to send to you by email. And I just want to see. Yeah, this is what the Arba Turi Even claims. That the mitzvah of chinuch kicks in when the child is 6 or 7, and the father has to take him to a malamed. Now, this is a Gemara in Baba Basra, which maybe we'll get a chance to study. It's called Takonas Yoshua ben Gamla. He's not a Tana that you see on every page in the Talmud. It's very rare, but he made a gigantic takana, which is called the educational system as we know it today. And believe it or not, before Yeshua ben Gamla, a child would only get a Torah education if his father was able to give him one. There was no school system. It's hard for us to imagine such a thing. But all the laws, which the Rambam codifies in Perek Beis of Hilchas Talmud Torah, of how to structure a school and how many children you need per class and who can be hired as a Rebbe and whether he could be paid, 1,000,001 different dimensions and nuances. All that is a result of one Jew by the name of Yeshua ben Gamla. See what one Jew could accomplish. The whole structure of the educational system, every province needs one malamed, and every 2 provinces, and if it's a gigantic, all these dinim, the whole structure is all Yeshua ben Gamla. Now, you don't take a child to the cheder if he's very, very young. The Gemara says that that's dangerous. They have to cross bridges and so forth and so on. So you wait till the child is about 6 or 7. And then molicho eitza malamed tinokus. You take him by the hand and you bring him to the malamed, to the local educational institution. That itself is chinuch d'Rabbanan. The whole institution of taking the child to a malamed at the age of 6 or 7, that's chinuch d'Rabbanan. So I say that even according to the Arba Turieven, that the father's obligation to teach Torah is DeOraisa, but on top of that, the icing on the cake, a second layer, is the rabbinic institution and obligation of chinuch. But now, according to the Arba Turieven, why doesn't the Rambam count 2 mitzvahs in Talmud Torah? One, a general mitzvah of Talmud Torah that I have to study Torah, and number 2, the father's obligation to teach his son Torah, which, according to the Arba Turieven, is DeOraisa from the pasuk V'libadetem osam espenecha. Why does it deserve to be counted as a separate mitzvah in Taryag? So I would like to suggest the following. The father's obligation to teach his son Torah is different. It's DeOraisa, but it's different than any other obligation. Or shall I say, it's not similar to every other obligation which is incumbent upon a person. It's called mitzvah de gufe. Not so. Talmud Torah doesn't fit that category. Because that same Gemara in Kiddushin that we mentioned last week, Chavtes in Kiddushin, on Amud Aleph for that Gemara, quotes in a Brisa a whole list of obligations of the father vis-a-vis his son. They're all DeOraisa. For example, Chayav Lamulo, Chayav Lifdoso, and Chayav L'Lamdo Torah. What is the common thread, the common denominator that links all those together? These are obligations that really guarantee that the child will get what he needs on a spiritual mitzvah-dika level. In other words, the Torah gave the child over to the father and said, you know what, this is a deposit. I'm giving you the child. You're responsible. You're responsible to make sure that the child is circumcised. You're responsible to make sure that the child, if he's a Bechar, has been redeemed. You're responsible to make sure that the child will study Torah. All these belong to, I call it a cluster or a group of mitzvos that form a group of their own, which are called mitzvahs haben al av. That the father is in charge of seeing to it that the child is properly cared for, so to speak. Now, let's take, for example, the mitzvah of Milah. The Rambam only has one mitzvah of Milah. He doesn't have a separate mitzvah of Milah on the father. The mitzvah of Milah is vis-a-vis himself. I have to make sure that I am circumcised. That's my obligation. In Pidyon Haben, the Rambam doesn't formulate a separate mitzvah in Taryag for being Poda your son. There's one mitzvah called Pidyon Haben. And likewise in Talmud Torah, which is again on that same list, the Rambam is not going to count the obligation of the father to teach his son Torah as a separate mitzvah. It belongs to the mitzvah Talmud Torah. So like the mitzvah of Milah, which belongs to me personally and to my obligation vis-a-vis my son, and the mitzvah of Pidyon Haben, which is my personal obligation and my obligation vis-a-vis my son, Talmud Torah is the same. It's my obligation to study Torah and to make sure that my son studies Torah. This is DeOraisa. It's DeOraisa, the father's obligation to circumcise his son. It's DeOraisa, the father's obligation to redeem his son and give 5 salam to the Kohen. It's the father's obligation in Torah to teach Talmud Torah to his son. But they won't be counted as a separate mitzvah. The mitzvah de gufe, which means the obligation vis-a-vis oneself, that's going to be counted. But when that mitzvah extends and expands to include the obligation of the father on that mitzvah vis-a-vis his son, that's not going to be counted as a separate mitzvah. Now, according to the Mishnah Kesef, that the obligation of the father vis-a-vis his son to teach his son Torah, and the son is 3 years old, Yodel Ledaber, that's chinuch. That's a rabbinic institution. That's not an obligation that's been on Torah. You can quote the pasuk Liman Tamosem Espinechem as a remez, as an asmachta to the rabbinic obligation that was established by the Rabbanim, but that's not DeOraisa. But the question is, why is the child considered higia lechinuch when he reaches the age of Yodel Ledaber? The mitzvah Talmud Torah in Shleimus, in its perfect form, includes Havana b'Torah. So I'm going to suggest the following. There are 2 different kiyumim in the mitzvah Talmud Torah. One is the kiyum of kriya, as it says Ledaber bam. That's even without Havana. And then there's a higher level of kiyum, but nevertheless an independent, separate level of kiyum, which is called Havana. And that's derived from the pasuk V'shinantam Levanecha. So then what we have is 2 psukim. And these 2 psukim reflect 2 different dimensions of the mitzvah Talmud Torah. And kriyas psukim, even without Havana, is a fulfillment of the mitzvah of Ledaber bam, and it stands independently on its own. And the shleimus ha-mitzvah is once the child is Yodel Ledaber. If you can read a whole pasuk, and you can train him and teach him, that is a mitzvah of higia lechinuch. So again, just to summarize, the machlokes now between the Arba Turi Even and the Mishnah Kesef is whether or not we view kriya b'Torah, reading psukim in the Torah without understanding them, as a shleimus ha-mitzvah. Whereas the Mishnah Kesef sees a mitzvah unto itself of reading Torah, and therefore the shleimus of that mitzvah would be Yodel Ledaber. The Arba Turi Even understands that the shleimus ha-mitzvah is Havanas HaTorah. And even if I grant you that there's a meaningful mitzvah to read psukim in the Torah, like for example, when we hear Kriyas HaTorah on Shabbos, not everyone understands what's going on. That's why Ezra made a takon in Bavel that they read a Targum. But we don't have that minig. So I think NCSY instituted some sort of minig to in between each aliyah to say over what's in the parsha, give a parsha highlight. Okay, fine, that's wonderful. But the way we do Kriyas HaTorah is without any commentaries, without any translations. We don't have any sort of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Many people in the audience have no clue what they're listening to. You get to parshios like Echveis, Mitzorah and Taras HaMitzorah. You don't even know what they're talking about by Baheres and then Seis and Sapah. What is this? It's all Chinese to me. So there is a meaningful kiyum. My father told me that back in his shtetl, when he was a child, there were people who would spend hours a day just reading Tillim. They were called Tillim Zuggers. They didn't understand what they were reading. So there is a meaningful kiyum of kriya. But according to the Arba Turi Even, as opposed to the Mishnah Kesef, that kriya is just a mixas mitzvah of Talmud Torah. That's not the totality and the shleimus of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Whereas the Mishnah Kesef says, no, there are 2 different categories of Talmud Torah. And within the context of kriya of psukim, that stands as a kiyum unto itself, and that shleimus of kriya can be achieved even by a child of 3 years old, because he knows how to read. So just to say in sum, what we can present here is a fundamental machlokes about how to interpret the Rambam. We thought that the Rambam for sure holds that the chiyuv of the father is DeOraisa, because the Rambam says Shenemar, quotes a pasuk, and that's what the Arba Turi Even thought. But it's not so simple, because there's a rule of thumb that if X is not obligated in Talmud Torah, then Y doesn't have to teach him Torah. So therefore I come to the conclusion that the father doesn't have to teach his son Torah. Well, how could that be? And the answer is that the pasuk Limad Tamosem Espinechem is referring to Gedolim, to an older child past bar mitzvah, and anything that happens to obligate the father before that age as a katan is all derabanan, and it all comes under chinuch. Okay, then. Any comments or questions before we?
But both sides, both the Kriya part and the Higiel Chinuch part is the Rabbanan still.
No. What we're saying is the following: that Kriya itself, according to the Arba Turi Even, is not only a kiyum DeOraisa, but it's also a chiyuv on the father to teach the son how to read psukim. That's all DeOraisa. When you get to the Mishnah Kesef, that's when you want to introduce chinuch and drabanan.
But that means that when a katan reads Torah, he's being Mekayim D'Oraisa?
No. I didn't mean to say that. What I meant to say was that when the father teaches the son how to read psukim, the father is Mekayim Mitzvah D'Oraisa. And according to the Mishnah Kesef, when the father teaches the son how to read psukim, he's Mekayim a mitzvah chinuch lahargilo to get him used to the reading of the Torah. It's only D'Rabbanan. But again, I would put this machlokes. If I were to write a book on Hilchas Talmud Torah, I would put this machlokes right up front. It is so fundamental. Two different understandings of what is the Rambam's intention when he says that the father has to teach his son Torah from the age of Yodei L'Daber. Okay, then, gentlemen. So I can't wish you a happy Tu B'Shvat because it's already been Tu B'Shvat. I can't wish you a happy Purim because it's too early for Purim. So I'll just wish you a happy week.